Deliberation for Civic Engagement in Chicago. So what we did is we looked at the use of dialogue and deliberation with residents in the Chicago area on community issues and public policy. So that's our scope. And we just sought to sketch kind of broad outlines of the field. This was never meant to be an exhaustive study. The first issue we encountered is a problem with language. We have no common way of talking about this work in Chicago. So very few people actually use the terms dialogue and deliberation, or D&D. So I was guided by the NCDD definitions. So dialogue is a process that allows people, usually in small groups, to share their perspectives and experiences with one another. It can and often does lead to personal and collaborative action. Deliberation is a closely related process that emphasizes the importance of examining options and trade-offs to make better decisions. And D&D includes an endless variety of methods, from circles to charrettes to participatory budgeting. Now this was a qualitative research project. We started with the secondary source review, then we convened a focus group of 10 experts, and then talked to people individually, 38 people. And the people we chose were selected to represent different aspects of this work, different processes, different purposes, and different fields. Now, as Joe said, the findings are summarized in a written report, and right now I'm just going to share some highlights, and I can only skim the surface. Now, this is very much a work in progress. So if you notice any important omissions today, there's index cards on the tables, so just write them down and leave them on the tables. And later you'll get an email link to the detailed report that's 30 pages, and a comment section on IPCE's Civic source where you can add missing things or ideas. So when we started this project, we didn't expect to find very much, and we found a lot. But the projects are isolated, they're not connected outside of their topical field, and this makes them vulnerable to leadership changes, either organizational or political. Very few people knew about national communities of practice like NCDD, and the great learning and resources available in this field. There's a very little sense of being part of a national movement to use D&D to engage and empower residents to develop wiser, more inclusive, and sustainable solutions to community needs. So we're kind of in a green shoot stage in Chicago. There are a few clusters that are very strong and a whole lot of promise. So if D&D is ever to become embedded in how Chicago communities address issues, we're going to need to work together. And the first step is to understand what we have now. Now, I adapted the NCDD Streams of Practice framework to segment the field in Chicago. And this was actually developed to categorize methods, not organizations. And organizations often use methods from multiple streams. But still, this is a useful way to think about who does what. So the 4 streams are exploration, decision-making, collaborative action, conflict transformation. And I'm going to go through these one at a time. So in exploratory dialogue processes, these are used to help people learn about themselves, their community, and issues. These are absolutely foundational, and that they develop skills, they build social capital, and they model good process. In Chicago, this is the best developed and supported stream. And the public loves this. It feels a real hunger for community and connection. In Chicago, the stream has been anchored in the humanities with 2 very important sources of support. With the Illinois Humanities Council, that has its own programming, like Cafe Society. They provide some funding, and facilities, like the Chicago Cultural Center. The Project on Civic Reflection provides process support. They're a national organization, but they're headquartered in Chicago, and a lot of projects in the stream have worked with them, which really shows how important it is to have local process support. So I'm just going to give you a quick feel for some of the kinds of places where this is used. Cultural and historical museums and centers have adopted public dialogue as part of becoming centers of civic engagement. One thing that's interesting, for example, about the Chicago Cultural Alliance is they're teaching dialogue skills to people from ethnic communities where personal opinions aren't normally shared in public. Chicago has a large and vibrant arts community. And over the past decade, public dialogue has been increasingly integrated into art. So you'll see, for example, a film or a play, followed by a facilitated discussion. And there are little arts and dialogue spaces popping up throughout the city. Our local public radio station, WBEZ, is a national innovator in community engagement. They convene public dialogues as part of fulfilling their core mission of connecting people to each other and the world around them. And they're experimenting with new forms of journalism, where they're listening to community conversations to identify stories, reframe issues, and potentially actually set the news agenda, which is very exciting. The ALA, which is headquartered in Chicago, has partnered with the National Issues Forums to train librarians to lead deliberative dialogues nationwide. The Des Plaines Public Library was really active in this area in the past. The Chicago Public Library hasn't done much here yet, but they do have space they make available to groups. And we have lots of interesting entrepreneurial dialogue initiatives, like Across the Table. These are facilitated discussions over dinner. We have lots of public dialogue and issue organizations, meetups, and book groups. So we see the exploration stream is rich. Decision-making processes are used, seek to influence public decisions and policies, and to improve public knowledge. They tend to be more deliberative in that the goal is to reach consensus recommendations. A lot of this is legally mandated, especially tied to federal funds in areas like transportation and land use. And in Chicago, surprise, this is the most challenging stream of the four. We have cultural issues, like the machine politics that limit public engagement. We have structural issues, the most important being the large number of units of government. We have legal issues. Our public engagement laws are antiquated and inadequate. And the most common processes we use, things like public hearings and town halls, actually tend to create adversarial relationships between residents and government and discourage real dialogue. But we have several bright spots. Because we have so many units of government, we can actually innovate at a small scale. In Chicago, we see this especially at the ward level. In the 1970s, Chicago was a nationally influential innovator in neighborhood governments, creating things like transportation councils and ward assemblies. Most of these initiatives were removed when those aldermen were replaced, but some have remained. And now we're in a similar situation with participatory budgeting. This is where residents decide how to allocate ward infrastructure funds. It combines D&D and voting. It started in Ward 49 in 2009, and it's now in 4 wards. But there's other interesting ward-level participatory processes and a lot of innovation actually in suburban townships and villages. Much of the local expertise in this decision-making stream is concentrated among planners and technical experts. They often work in topics where public engagement is legally required. The Chicago Metropolitan Agency for Planning is the big government planning agency. They do extensive public consultation using D&D for the comprehensive regional plan. The Metropolitan Planning Council is a Chicago home, a project for public spaces that develops physical spaces for community members to interact. The Center for Neighborhood Technology has developed some very innovative games for public engagement. And a lot of the really interesting D&D work happening is in the sustainability sector. For example, the Chicago Community Climate Action Toolkit that was developed by the Field Museum uses D&D for policy implementation, helping communities to develop solutions that work for them. Some of the public deliberation, best public deliberation in Chicago actually happens in high schools that are part of the Illinois Democracy Schools program. And MICVA Challenge is a homegrown, nationally recognized innovator in action civics. And they actually use D&D with youth in all of the streams. Chicago also has an office of the Constitutional Rights Foundation, which is the international expert in school-based deliberation. And there's some dialogue initiatives with university students and national efforts to promote more. So those are the bright spots. The picture in city and county government is both bright and dark. We have a new mayor and a new Cook County board president. Both of them talk about engaging residents. Most of what they've done so far is primarily PR. Most of the dialogue has been among stakeholders, but still there's a real sense of possibility. Most of the city's policy consultations are not optimal. A lot of the officials lack process skills, but the 2012 cultural plan was different. And this is probably due to the influence of all this wonderful dialogue in the arts community. So it's an example of how one stream can influence another. And education and crime are probably the topics of most concern to residents in Chicago. And we face a similar situation now as we did in the late 80s and 90s when the local school councils and CAFs were introduced. At the time, these were considered important innovations in empowered public engagement. Neither ever quite worked as their advocates intended, and both have been weakened over time. So we're in a space where we need something new. Chicago Public Schools, through their Family and Community Engagement Office, FACE, has been experimenting with community area councils, CACs, which engage residents and stakeholders to develop community-wide strategies for schools. Unfortunately, due to leadership changes, the recommendations have not been implemented, but they're still promising efforts. And Chicago Public Police Department has just defunded CAPS, so it's really unclear what's going to happen next there. So we see the decision-making stream is challenging, but has some surprising assets. Now, collaborative action processes empower groups and individuals to solve complex problems by identifying shared needs and desires and generating ideas and action plans. In Chicago, collaborative action is inextricably linked to community organizing. Now, because of the work of generations of community organizers, more residents in Chicago are connected to community-based organizations than any other U.S. cities. And because of this, they've become the de facto gateways to residents. So practitioners in all streams work with them to recruit residents and run consultations for them. This can be very efficient and effective, but it can also limit the diversity of perspectives. So there's a lot of interest in new ways of reaching residents. Now, community organizers use various D&D techniques in their own work, but they tend to be limited to specific tasks like visioning, or used just with leaders. And when I ask community organizers about D&D, most of them talk to me about one-on-one interviews, how being listened to helps people hear themselves, how that's empowering, it drives commitment, and this helps them mobilize residents for action, which is their priority. And this is actually an important point, because listening is at the core of all effective D&D processes in all the streams. Because of their history, Chicago community organizers tend to be rather ambivalent towards D&D. Dialogue especially can be a problematic concept, can be seen as replacing or delaying action. And many have encountered challenges with deliberative processes involving government related to issues of ownership, roles, and responsibilities. But there are new models of community organizing that actually integrate D&D throughout the work. These use collaborative thinking versus leader-centered models, and they successfully use deliberation to work with government, combining the wisdom and commitment of residents with the power and resources of government. And a great example of this is COFI, Community Organizing and Family Issues. So we see the collaborative action stream in Chicago is complex. Conflict transformation processes are used to resolve conflicts, foster personal healing, and to improve relationships between groups. This is an area of tremendous need in Chicago and some very promising work. Many of the discussions on public policy issues, especially in the suburbs, are tinged with undertones of racism, often linked to income inequality. And these can create real barriers to decision-making in areas like housing, education, and taxation. And race dialogue can help remove these barriers. There's a lot happening right now in Evanston, supported by the YWCA. And in the past, there was a lot of work in the collar counties with Everyday Democracy and their study circle method. Restorative justice is a very exciting, rapidly growing area in Cook County. These are community-owned dialogue processes where residents themselves solve conflict in ways that benefit everyone. We have a very important champion in Judge Sophia Hall of the Cook County Circuit Court. This is part of Illinois law, and it's been moving from the courts into the community, becoming embedded in schools, public housing, and churches. Now, incivility in public discourse is a big issue nationally, but it's not actually a huge problem in Chicago. Nevertheless, I wanted to point out that the ABA, American Bar Association, which is headquartered in Chicago, has taken up this topic nationally. So you see the conflict transformation stream is very important in its own right, but also because it supports decision-making. Now, to be effective, efforts in all of the streams need to be supported. They need skills, technology, funding, research, and communities of practice. Now, local skills and process support is absolutely essential to grow this work. The strong clusters have it, the weak ones don't. We have a few homegrown groups that do this work and several local representatives of national organizations. Most focus just on one method. Online D&D is a big growth area internationally. In Chicago, it's very limited. City government tends to use online space for crowdsourcing, open data, and practical apps. So most of the online dialogue on community issues happens organically on neighborhood sites like every block. But some of these are monitored by aldermen, and planners also use technology tools. Now, the McCormick and Spencer Foundations are the most knowledgeable funders in Chicago on D&D. Their focus is civic education, but they're also part of the Funders Learning Collaborative PACE. Outside of those organizations, there's in general relatively limited awareness and understanding of D&G in the Chicago Foundation community. And this is part of why funding this work is an enormous challenge. A lot of the projects fall outside of traditional funding models. They encounter issues with evaluation and judging effectiveness. We have a wonderful resource in Chicago and many local academics whose research interest includes D&D. We have a few promising examples of collaboration between university and practitioners, like the UIC's Great Cities Institute and IPCE supporting participatory budgeting, and the Adler School supporting restorative justice. Now, Sandy's going to talk more about communities of practice, but these are people in the same field who share learning and collaborate. They're very important in developing new fields. There's nothing like this for civic engagement in Chicago, but a few related groups and then national communities of practice. So basically, how do we move from the green shoot stage to the blooming garden, where D&D is absolutely embedded in our communities and it's hard to get rid of, regardless of who's in charge, who the leaders are. The exploration stream is well developed, but still has plenty of space to grow. We can tackle new topics, move into new geographies, new demographic groups, and especially develop new methods. Now, this is foundational work, and then it models good process. So it can be used, for example, to promote civil discourse. And there's actually an initiative from the National Institute for Civil Discourse called Your Words Count that wants to help residents, as many residents as possible, to experience quality public dialogue themselves, so they'll demand it from their leaders, including those in Washington. Now, decision-making is the most challenging stream, but also the area of the greatest need, and actually the most opportunity. We have complex, interconnected problems that need new solutions. We need to reconsider the roles of government and residents. For example, we could change the conversation on the city budget from privatization to government as facilitator, which opens up all kinds of other options. We have new leadership and participatory budgeting to build upon. We have opportunities to improve processes and skills. We can consider reforming the legal frameworks for public engagement. And the most important thing here, and I heard this from several very knowledgeable people, is to be open to unexpected champions. Now, as the home of community organizing, we have a unique opportunity in Chicago to combine the strengths of community organizing and D&D. They have a lot to teach and learn from each other. We can move from dialogue into action, or use D&D to draw on community wisdom to develop new solutions to complex problems. Restorative justice is a fabulous model for embedding D&D in communities. It can spread throughout more communities, and most importantly, it needs to link up with other kinds of approaches that strengthen communities in other ways. Also considering how racism and income inequality are blocking progress in many policy areas, we need to think about how to better integrate dialogue across difference into the policymaking. Now, if D&T is ever to become embedded in our communities, we need skills spread throughout those communities. So an opportunity for massive skills training that's affordable and appropriate. We're also missing process generalists who can see the big picture, who are versed in multiple methods, and can create new ones. In technology, we barely scratched the surface of what's possible. We can combine open data with dialogue, for example, building a Chicago's city data website. We can mix online and face-to-face work. And we can consider, for example, serious games to engage youth. Now, this work needs to be better funded. So we need to expand awareness and understanding of D&D among funders. And then they have an opportunity to incorporate D&D into other projects and consider the legacy they're leaving behind in building a civic infrastructure for this work. Researchers have an essential role to play as thought leaders. This is something that's really missing in Chicago. We need people to build a research-supported case to government and funders explaining how D&D works and why it's important. They also can help practitioners to better define and measure success and think about new models. But ultimately, if we're going to ever change how Chicago communities address issues, we have to work together in a community practice to collectively build a civic infrastructure. We need to collaborate across fields and streams, share learning, develop common supports, open new paths that other people can follow, and leave something behind that others can use. So over lunch, we're going to discuss in small groups what this means and what we might do next. But right now, we're going to take about 10 minutes for questions. guess I'm going to facilitate the questions. So you can address questions to me on the report content and anything related to what IPCE's role is to Joe.